Buonasera a tutti, good evening and welcome to the Italian Radio Hour. Io sono Viviana and I would like to welcome back our regular listeners and also welcome any new listeners. Also, be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at the Italian Radio Hour and subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch up on any past video interviews. Vorrei dare il benvenuto ai nostri ascoltatori da tutto il mondo, grazie per essere con noi anche oggi mentre continuiamo il nostro viaggio per l'Italia e la cultura italiana. In Nazi occupied Italy, carrying a loaf of bread could mean carrying a message. Riding a bicycle could mean transporting a bomb. And being underestimated could save your life. Today on the Italian Radio Hour, I'm joined by Suzanne Cope, scholar, narrative journalist, and author of Women of War, the Italian assassins, spies, and couriers who fought the Nazis. Her book tells the extraordinary true stories of four Italian women who fought back against fascism and Nazi occupation using whatever tools they had: wit, courage, secrecy, and an unshakable sense of responsibility to one another. This conversation situates their experiences within the broader political context of Italy's collapse in 1943, the German occupation, and the civil war that followed, while also addressing questions of gender, memory, and historical erasure. It is a discussion about how resistance actually functions and why women's contribution have so often been minimized in post-war narratives. The stories we choose to remember and forget will shape the world we live in today. So don't go anywhere. Today we'll hear a voice of history that has often gone unheard. Parli italiano? Do you want to learn, improve, or master your Italian? Istituto Mondo Italiano can help. Located in the heart of Regent Square, Mondo Italiano offers small group classes and one-on-one private tutoring in person or online to help you learn Italian in no time. Visit us online at istitutomondoitaliano.org.
I'm great. Thanks for having me. What a wonderful overview of this book. It's fabulous. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for actually writing Women of War, but I always like to allow our guests to introduce herself so that our listeners can get more acquainted with your development as a writer, your background. Did you always know that you were going to be a writer? How did you get here?
Well, the way you asked it makes me go back and want to talk a little bit about my nanny that I mentioned her in brief in the prologue. And really growing up, I'm from Western New York, and my family, my grandmother and grandfather, both first generation Italians, and they ran a small airport after World War II in south of Buffalo, north of Erie. And my grandmother ran the office, and she was very politically minded. And I was always the grandkid who loved to read and was really interested in politics and interested in all of these stories that she was telling me. And so I see now how that really planted the seeds of my research today. She, at the time she was like, "You are going to get into politics. You're going to be the first woman president." And of course, that's not what happened. But I
It's
really
still
see.
time.
I think that ship has sailed, but but I do see her influence in my direction in writing about this. I started my scholarship in addition to scholarship around education. I teach writing at NYU. I was also interested in food studies for a long time, which of course, being Italian American, you think about food and how it relates to your culture very deeply. And this project started off as this kernel of an idea around how food was used as political and social change during the war. It was part of a larger project around that topic. And that book idea of different stories of food as a tool for change turned into my last book, which was around the Black independence movement in the United States. And that was written mostly during the pandemic, and really important work. I interviewed Black Panther Party members and other members, other people part of this movement from the 1960s mostly. And then as soon as that was wrapping up and I was thinking about my next project, I kept going back to this story that was part of my original thinking. And by then, I realized it was around so much more than food. Yes, food is important. We know it's important to culture. It's important to bring people together. But I really saw that food was a way that women could exercise their power, particularly when they are underestimated. And so, as I dug into the stories of women in the resistance in Italy, I saw, well, first of all, it's the war, so there's not a lot of food. And these stories beyond supporting people through food were so unbelievable. And I couldn't believe they hadn't been told in English before. And so I spent a long time, I spent a summer just gathering these stories, figuring out what my book might look like. And so I settled on these four women, but it was really moving from food to thinking about how yeah, being underestimated was a way that they could show their power, and how feminized work was so important and also very unsung. I mean, so many of these women were part of, were providing food and shelter and messages and all of these things that feel like they're not that important, but still could have killed them and were absolutely essential to the resistance. And and I'll say one more thing really quickly is
Yeah,
that
yeah,
also
yeah.
makes me think about my grandmother who would have been the exact same age as these women had she lived in Italy when she was young, but had she stayed in Italy, I imagine her as one of them.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that a companion read of A Women of War might be Power Hungry, obviously by
Thank
you,
you. Yes.
because we have the feeling, the figure of Aileen Quinn and the Macomb restaurant. So, as I said, you don't, you do challenge this romanticized narrative of Italian food and culture by revealing inequality and exploitation beneath them. And so in Women of War, similarly complicates the heroic narratives of the resistance, and you actually navigate through the tensions between admiration and historical honesty in your work. So that's it's Women of War seems to be the perfect segue, although they are set in two very different historical moments. But the book centers, in my opinion, both on people whose labor and agency have been systematically overlooked. So,
You're such a wonderfully careful reader. Thank you so much.
so
Um,
do we,
I
mhm.
did find so many interesting connections between these stories that were surprising to me, as I was writing it, and it was really wonderful to see how these works, and then hopefully where my work continues to go builds upon these stories and tells these larger narratives of women's agency during these times of
Yeah.
oppression.
So before we're not going to turn this interview into a history lesson, but I think it's worth to maybe cite a little bit what Italy looked like in the time frame that you talk about in the book, and then eventually we can also address the after 1943. But I will let you lead us into your historical explorations of what was happening in Italy.
Sure. Well, I do think, and even thinking about myself as someone who is a student of history, that Americans so rarely are taught or remember what was happening in World War II if it was not involving directly American troops. That tends to be the American history is so focused on the American experience. And so I had to learn a lot about what was happening in Italy at this time, and I was surprised at the gaps in what I understood about the history. But of course, Mussolini had been in power for 20 plus years. He wrested almost, complete authoritarian power in the early 1920s. And so our protagonists were born in the late 19 teens and the early 1920s. And so their entire life was under Mussolini's rule. He, invented fascism. That was the party that he was part of. That was his ideology, which meant that his regime had complete control over all aspects of Italian life. Over what would be taught in school over, how workers could operate and what they might be paid. Women were vastly told to just, be wives and make babies. You got bonuses the more babies you birthed. There were quotas for how many women could be in many fields, and women were basically shut out of many fields, many industries, and then he also kept saying, I mean, there is some debate over whether he literally said, "Let's bring back the Roman Empire," but that was his gist, is he wanted to, expand Italy's holdings across the world, and so he was very imperialistic. He was militaristic, even though Italy was not really in a position financially and with resources to be doing all of these military actions. And they were also broadly unpopular. So he really created a culture of fear where people, through his squadristi, through his armed thugs, he kept resistance very, very underground, because people would be arrested or sent in confino, sent in confinement, like basically to a semi-deserted island, as punishment if they were doing political organizing. And so it wasn't until he gets into war, he joins Hitler in war, and vastly unpopular. It was very difficult times in the beginning of World War II. I mean, it was just, rations were very low. People were starving, working long hours, not getting paid. Their fathers, brothers, sons were headed off to war, many of them dying, not even properly equipped, fighting this war that they didn't really personally support. And so the book begins, the most of the action of the book begins in 1943, which is about a week after the Allies land in Sicily and make their way across Sicily. And so now they have landed in Italy, and then they make their way into the mainland. And so Churchill had convinced the Allies, we need to take Italy. It was a strategic move. And so Italy sees the writing on the wall. They're like, we need to give up, to surrender, or otherwise our country will be completely, torn apart. And so they negotiate. They kick out Mussolini. This happens early in the book, and they install Badoglio, who is a kind of a weak, still somewhat conservative leader, but he takes a very long time to negotiate the surrender with the Allies. And in those 45 days, and it was 45 days long, and they call it the 45 days, that's when the resistance really foments, and people start to connect with each other, and even a future government is the nascent future government is born. And so people are brought into the resistance. And then as soon as the surrender is announced, in the beginning of September, and suddenly Germany, which has known what is happening all along, they had been sending troops all across, pretty much central, and northward in Italy, because by then the Allies had landed in Salerno, south of Rome, and they said, "Well, guess what? You are now an occupied country." And so that's where we are, end of summer of 1943, where most of the action takes place between then and the end of the war in 1945.
Mhm. So I want to read just some statistics, some data before. I actually found a video, some testimonies of women, not necessarily the women that you talk about, but we will hear the sentiment and maybe why some of them join, and also what do they look like? Because again, sometimes we do have depictions of women that, monsters, even among in Italy, what they were talking about, how they were describing these women. But as far as the statistics, there were 36,000 partisans killed, 10,000 civilians killed in reprisals. 33,000 Italian soldiers died in concentration camps, 70,000 women participated in defense groups, 35,000 women took part in partisan warfare, 623 women executed, 4,563 women arrested and tortured, and then obviously thousands deported, including Ravensbrück. So let's see what these women are all about, and we'll hear from two of them because it leads me to next couple of questions. So let's see if we can share that with our audience.
Le donne che hanno lavorato in questo periodo non erano né delle fanatiche né delle donne col coltello in mano e in bocca, come si è detto. Erano delle brave donne di famiglia, delle donne che da tanti anni erano sotto delle sofferenze e in quel periodo in particolare gli uomini, i figli, i mariti, i fratelli erano in pericolo, chi era in guerra, chi era già morto e le donne si sono sentite il compito di salvare la casa, in casa quello che era salvabile.
Anche per una persona di cultura mi pare che fosse logico quella posizione che a un certo momento bisogna operare, perché operare significa dimostrare coi fatti la validità delle idee. E allora naturalmente ciascuno di noi ha fatto quello che ha potuto nel limite delle sue forze e quindi io ho scelto anch'io la strada della cospirazione.
Okay, so we're going to stop here because now we do have the two questions that I was interested in asking you. One, from the accent, these two women are from different parts of Italy, so maybe you can elaborate more on what resistance looked like, perhaps in different parts of Italy. And then here also, I think there might be the second lady say, even in the educated circles, we decided that actions will speak, just to make a long message short, actions will speak more than 1,000 words. And she decided to join. So can you tell us a little bit about what the resistance, the areas that you also looked at, archives, interviews, you did an amazing research work. So tell us a little more about that.
Sure. So I ended up focusing on four different areas and women, one woman per area, which helped me tell the broader story. So, of course, there's lots of stories that are similar, but also different that I just couldn't fit into this book. The questions are such good ones because, it's more implied the different backgrounds of these women as we, both from where they're living, but also the ways that they were brought up. So we have Carla Capone, who is in Rome, and so the kind of work, she was from a upper middle class family, and broadly she and in a lot of ways Bianca from Torino, Bianca Guidetti Serra, they had a similar-ish upbringing as far as they were from upper middle class families that were anti-fascist, but not explicitly so. So neither of them were brought up, really with explicit lessons of anti-fascism. And it was because it was their parents were scared, like many people, even if that was the way that they personally believed. I read lots of tales of the adults just kind of talking quietly and not involving their children, because if their children let anything slip, the entire family could be in danger. And so both of them speak of moments when they were in their teens, when they had this larger realization of political activism and how, where they finally realized, oh, this is how my family believes, and this is, how I believe. And so I was always very interested with this book and with my other work about that moment when people became activated and also had that larger awareness. But it was very hard because, as I mentioned, in passing, this was not taught in schools. Like, curriculum was created to show Italy in the most favorable light, to not talk about other, possible ways of governing. And so students, by and large, were unaware of this unless they were finding out from their family or through other means. Books were not generally explicitly banned, but were very hard to find, or were banned and essentially banned. So there was a lot of text too that were you could get in trouble or be suspected of something for reading. And so that was their two experiences. And then also that's how they were similar as far as their upbringing, but then how the resistance was different in those two places, both urban centers. But we have Carla, of course. Rome is a big city, and so she was part of this underground guerrilla team.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Gapisti, and at first she was just All four of the women were couriers, staffette, and that just meant initially that's what they were thinking. This is what women needed to do. They were just the ones who would carry things from place to place. They would get food to people. They would carry messages because women weren't suspected as being political, and so there's tales. It's funny because I tell this story in the book in passing. It's not about either of these four women, but it's almost the most common story I hear, even in other the rare things that are written about these women, which is that a woman, a staffetta came to a roadblock and was carrying a bag, and the person said, "Oh, what's inside the bag?" And she says, "Bombs," and they laugh, and then he lets her through, and she did have bombs in her bag, and that's how much they were just assumed to not be part of the resistance, that they didn't even have to lie. But then it became clear, partway through this occupation, that in fact they were part of the resistance, and it became more and more dangerous for women to move around. And so even though it seems like, oh, they were couriers, that's such a small thing. I mean, to be caught with any of the items that they were carrying could have meant exactly what you were reading those statistics. It could have meant arrest, torture, death. I mean, deportation. Like even carrying food that they knew was going to a partisan, that they could have been killed for that. And so it was incredibly dangerous work. So the other difference too, so we have Carla, who was part of the guerrilla warfare groups, of which they had others. Teresa Mattei was in Florence, Firenze, and she was also part of a little less involved, but she was also part of the Geppisti there. And they had Geppisti in other cities too. But the difference too in this was part of their organizing is that Bianca, being in Torino, that was a very industrialized city. There were lots of factories. And in fact, her job at the beginning of the war was she was basically a social worker where she was trained. She went to law school, but couldn't find a job in law because she was a woman. And so she got a job as a social worker, and that got her, she was very connected to like the Fiat plant, for example, Montefiore. And so she heard the stories of these women and all of the issues they had. They didn't have enough to eat. They were the primary caregivers of their family. They were, they didn't have enough fuel to keep themselves warm. And so she was advocating on behalf of them, but also then when she became more involved in the resistance, she was able to help organize them. And she became, that became very powerful in these industrial centers like Torino and Milan, because they had these large factories of people who were striking or were doing other actions together, both to get themselves more rations, for example, or better pay, but also they also saw themselves as part of the resistance, and they became a very important resistance bloc. And so then we have Anita Malavasi, who was from Reggio Emilia. She was brought up on a farm outside of the city, and then her family moved to the city when she was a teenager and opened a cafe. And so it represents perhaps the more working class resistance member, and also from a smaller city, this is a small city, but also she was in touch with a lot of the folks from smaller towns around the city. And she was a staffetta at first. She was working in her family's cafe, and it became this hub of anti-fascist, young people would meet there and talk, and that was her education. And there's a story in the book of she looked back and saw that this was a moment when she realized that her parents, were more politically minded than she realized. But at the time, her parents would never have told their children their political leanings. And so she represents the story of the working class. She's a staffetta who starts going, outside of the city. I mean, they were so they didn't have enough guns. They didn't have enough of really anything. But these staffetta had to take guns or other munitions. They would be taking one gun, they'd go get it from outside of the city, bring it into the city for an action, then return it to the bands of partisans who were hiding in the mountains or in the plains outside of the city. And so she was someone who was constantly going back and forth doing that kind of work. And then in the summer of 1944, she was suspected of being a partisan. And so she had to escape or else she would have been arrested. And so she became one of the first women who lived lived with the bands of mostly men. There ended up being more women as the war went on. And she was, a member of the armed militia in the mountains, but she still was a staffetta, but based out of these these battalions in the mountains, and she'd be walking miles and miles and miles on these old shepherding paths that the partisans took over, and that was their main mode of transportation. And a quick note on my research is that these paths in around the area of in the Apennine Mountains have been turned into hiking paths in the last decade or so, and they have these monuments for the partisans all along the way, and maybe once or twice a year they'll have these hikes that are led by people who give you tours and give you history lessons, and it's really, really profound. I was able to just walk a small part of one of the paths that I was pretty sure that Anita had walked, and to like literally walk in her footsteps, it was so incredibly powerful to see that. And so I tried to put myself in these women's footsteps as many times as I could. But then that brings me to my last gal, Teresa Mattei. She was part of these four women, and also just largely, this is a more rare occurrence. She was part of an explicitly anti-fascist family. Her father, Ugo, was a labor leader. He was known to be, anti-Mussolini. And in fact, he would be arrested sometimes if Mussolini or other high officials were coming to Firenze. He would be arrested for a couple days just to make sure he wasn't causing any trouble, and then they'd let him go. He was friends with the Oliveris and the Ginsburgs. And so the Roselli brothers. So he was really known to be, very active in the resistance. And it's, this was a constant question for me. And I asked other, scholars, particularly, Italian scholars, of course, how they would just let him be this known member of the resistance, because it was very rare to have these intellectuals, these folks who could be speaking out. And the answer I received is that they were allowed to speak out to a point. And it was kind of like this, unspoken line that and of course, some of these people I just mentioned crossed that line. The Roselli brothers ended up dead. So you could be a little outspoken, especially if so they were upper middle class, they had money, they had some connections, especially if you had the means, you could be a little bit outspoken and, and still be okay and not, not jailed, not killed. But as soon as you cross this, no one even really knew what the line was. And many of their friends did suffer this. You might be arrested or killed. And so she was brought up knowing these people and was a known anti-fascist, took part, her father and her older brothers, they would go on actions that I write about in the book, defacing plaques. And she even had her own moments of, in high school, she got kicked out of high school for protesting the racial laws. And so she, went into the resistance with her eyes wide open and very knowledgeable, which was much more rare. But she became a very trusted staffetta of the resistance because of that, because they knew that she could be trusted because of the family she was from. And so she was a staffetta. She also was part of the Gapisti. She was also a leader of the women's groups the defense groups you mentioned, and also student groups. And this was what was happening in Firenze. There were some factories she helped to organize, but certainly it wasn't as industrial as the North.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Do you love Italian food? Want to learn the secrets of homemade pasta, sauces, and traditional recipes, just like Nana used to make? At Mondo Italiano, our authentic Italian cooking classes bring the taste of Italy right to Pittsburgh. From fresh pasta to regional specialties, every class is a delicious journey through Italy's culinary traditions. Spots fill quickly, so reserve your seat today. Call us at 412-478-2681 or find us online. Mondo Italiano, where Italy comes alive one dish at a time.
Un caffè, per favore. For more than 35 years, Pittsburgh has started its mornings with La Prima Espresso. From freshly roasted beans from around the world to the perfect espresso or cappuccino, every cup is crafted with care. Stop by and enjoy the warmth of our baristas and familiar faces, or bring the taste of Italy home. Order online today at laprima.com. La Prima Espresso, Pittsburgh's coffee. So we're back with Suzanne Cope, author of Women of War, the Italian Assassins, Spies, and Couriers who fought the Nazis. That is definitely a must-have book in your library. And we have just heard from Suzanne telling us about the four women that are indeed described in the book. So I do have a little follow-up question for each one of them. So let's start with Carla. Carla Caponi, Rome, central to the Via Rasella attack in March of 1944. Am I correct? She's the one that has left quite extensive memoirs, right?
Yes.
How was the experience of going through that material? Because, I mean, you don't romanticize. I mean, these women have gone through, were the victims of violence. So political violence it's a tough topic to read about and to write about. So.
For sure, for sure. I mean, it's memoir like that are such a gift for folks like me wanting to tell this larger story, because I can get into their head in a way that you can't if you're just reading someone else's version of what they're saying. And also it centers her story, because her partner in both in the resistance and also beyond, Rosario, he wrote a number of memoirs. And so I would sometimes cross check a moment where they both were present and see what they both had to say about that experience. And there weren't stark differences, but certainly I always centered her memory of various stories, and I tried to really tell it from her point of view. So it's wonderful anytime in the book if you have one of the women saying that they felt a certain way or they did something, it was because that was what they said in their testimonies. So Carla left behind, a really robust memoir that I think should be translated into English. It was, I was really honing improving my Italian as I was doing this research. I had begun studying it many years, 20 years ago, maybe. And now I can read pretty well, but I don't have as much opportunity to listen or speak. But I'm going to Sicily in a couple months with my family. And so I've been practicing again. But yeah, so she left behind these great memoirs, and she and Teresa both became elected officials after the war. And so they became somewhat public figures. I asked a number of folks as I was researching, how well people knew them. And, at the time of when they were in government, they were relatively well known. And it seems like some young people haven't heard of them. Maybe today they're not as well known, but it made them public figures. And so there were also, they gave speeches and interviews, and I drew from that, in the years afterwards. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay. Then I'm moving again up north to Bianca Guidetti Serra. As you have mentioned, highly industrialized, and some strikes that people went on probably involved up to 20% of the population, you were saying. So these must have, and her tasks, her resistance work was centered on information and strikes and logistics. That was probably a kind of labor that was pretty threatening to the Nazi, wasn't it?
Oh my gosh. I mean, like all of these stories, right? They don't really, they didn't see it as much of a threat until they saw what she could do. And these women are all in their early 20s. They are so young. It is just astounding to me how they are so young and just doing this incredibly brave work. But yeah, she was one of the main organizers of this. It was the biggest strike in Nazi occupied territory during the war. And they, I did the math for an event recently, and they got, up to 20% of the population of occupied Italy went on strike during about a 7, 8 day period in early March 1944. And she was one of the main organizers of that. And that was really a turning point of the resistance, because that was the moment that all of these, millions of people went on strike, and they realized that they were part of something bigger. And that they were actually what they realized what side they were on. It was as if they couldn't stay in the middle anymore, because that there's a statistic, I read a rough statistic that, really there was maybe 10, 15, 20% of people who were active, on supporting the fascists or supporting the resistance, with a large number in the middle that were trying to just stay out of it and survive. And then by the time these strikes happened, that middle couldn't really stay in the middle anymore. And so a lot of them threw their hats in with the resistance and realized, this is the future I want. And I want better protections for my family, and higher wages and more rations. And so she was a main leader of that. And the women, who, of course, so many men were in hiding or had gone off to war, because there still was a fascist army that was now under control, kind of by Mussolini, but he was more of a figurehead, really, by the Nazis. And so the women were much of these factories. The women were primarily who went on strike. There were still many skilled men as well who went on strike. But for the women, they were instrumental for making sure that these strikes happened, even though they were often caring for both elderly and children at home. They were risking so much, but they knew that this was what they had to do to achieve their aims. And so this was a really important moment. It was also a moment when the Nazis, the Axis, realized that the people were against them, and they became a lot more scared. They became more brutal for a period of time, but that was the moment they realized, many historians think that this is one of the moments where the tide was shifted in the war. And it was almost certain that the Allies were going to win, because the people were on their side.
And Carlo, she was pretty close to to Primo Levi. Apologize. So, can you elaborate on the Jewish experience in Italy prior to, around 1938, and then after 1943?
So largely, if you were Jewish in Italy, I mean, the Jewish population was very well integrated into Jewish life. In fact, Teresa Mattei, her mother's side of the family was Jewish, and she would, by German standards at the time, she would be considered Jewish, even though she wasn't practicing. And then Bianca, her boyfriend, fiance during the war, he was Jewish. Many of her friends were Jewish. She was very good friends with Primo Levi, and so she was as soon as these racial laws were passed in the late 1930s, Mussolini passed these laws, kind of showing his buddy-buddiness with Hitler, and they were very unpopular. This was another kind of death knell in his leadership, because he was doing it against the will of the people. And so this is also the moment that, after decades of people not wanting to resist, of being afraid of Mussolini, they very explicitly resisted, reinforcing or enforcing the racial laws, because they just didn't believe in it. And this was where they, similar to Hitler, he slowly started to strip Jewish people in Italy of various rights. They couldn't hold many jobs. They couldn't, have most of their resources. And so they never really they never rounded up Jewish people in Italy until the Nazis occupied the country, and then the fascists were working with the Nazis to start the first deportations. And in fact, there are a lot of tales of even fascist officers saving Jewish people, either refugees or Jewish Italians. But as soon as the Nazis occupied the country, people started ringing the bells of alarm that you need to go into hiding. And of Jewish people who went into hiding very soon after that occupation, at the beginning of September 1943, I have the exact statistic in the book, but something like 80% ended up living through the war. And so they were sometimes hidden in convents, or they were shipped off to different people in the country and just, been told to pretend that you're family visiting or displaced for whatever reason. And a lot of people knew that that their neighbor was likely hiding Jewish people, but they kept quiet. If they were found out, and certainly people were, entire neighborhoods were sometimes set on fire. Blocks of people were killed. I mean, it was horrific retribution. And so the Italian people who did help save their Jewish neighbors really did so at a great cost to themselves. But you had Bianca, who was the pretty much the closest friend to Primo Levi, and so he was able, who was not Jewish, and so he would send her postcards letting her know that he was still alive, and she knew where his mother and sister were hiding, and so she would convey messages to them, and so it is she's definitely part of that. Survivor narrative, because he is, as many people probably know, he is one of the main voices who lived through, being in a concentration camp and began to really spread the stories of the atrocities that really happened there.
Yeah. You mentioned Teresa Mattei a few times being then involved. She was the youngest woman involved in writing the Italian Constitution. So what does her involvement in writing the Constitution symbolize for you?
I mean, this was a movement, a feminist movement. These women were suddenly extremely emancipated from this life where they were told they could only be, wives and mothers, and they had to, listen to their husband. And in so many of the stories that I read, not just from these four women, a lot of women who were active, even though, as I'm saying, I'm telling you these stories that they were risking their lives just by, carrying food. They said it was the moment they felt the most free. It was a moment where they were doing things on their terms. They were doing things that they believed in, not because someone told them to do it. And a lot of them expressed, said that when, the war was nearing an end, they were almost worried about going back to, even though it was going to be a free Italy without Mussolini, they were very worried about, being under a male relative's thumb again. And so this was a big feminist movement afterwards. And, it's hard for any sort of cultural shift. And so there was a lot of tension. And I've talked to, I definitely, I made it a point not to focus too much on post-war because it's complicated in a lot of stories, but in speaking with a lot of the particularly the women archivists and librarians, I was asking them about these waves of feminism in Italy after the war, and you could kind of even trace them with when the scholarship came out. Immediately after the war, people were very rabid. They wanted these stories of both men and women after the war, and then things kind of quieted down for a while, and it was almost like a backlash to this sudden emancipation. And then around the time when a lot of these women, were getting elderly, and perhaps people noticed that we were going to lose their stories, there was this great push to capture some of their stories again. And so there was this, ebb and flow of wanting to recognize these women and also just recognize, women more broadly. And I think that echoes the various feminist movements in Italy. But Teresa was definitely part of the defense groups that has a very long name, but abbreviated the GDD. During the war, it turned into UDI, which is a post-war women's organization that's still been very robust, working for the rights of women pretty much ever since the end of the war. And Teresa was a big part of that.
Mm-hmm. So so you kind of already answered my next question, which was why were women's resistance stories so quickly erased after the war? So it looks like now we are resurfacing, we're re-study again, or more than study again, going after the stories. So do you have any opinion on why after they moved into kind of quickly forgetting, because we don't want memories to be erased?
Forgetting is exactly the right word. There's been other historians who have written about this, and who have basically said that the way Italy dealt with the Mussolini years, with that legacy, was to want to just, push it aside, like forget about it. Let's just move on and not deal with it. And so even Natalia Ginsburg wrote an essay saying exactly this very soon after the war. And so it was, I believe, and I'm echoing really what other scholars who have studied this a lot more believe, that if Italy had reconciled their 20 plus years under fascist rule, that perhaps they would have move forward more concretely. But instead it was kind of this ebb and flow. They never really dealt with these really, very conservative family values, conservative social values. And so even though they felt this freedom right after the war, by not dealing with it, they didn't really change. And so that's why we do have these stereotypes that I think are based in reality of still a very strong patriarchal society. And I heard from a lot of, when I'm speaking with a lot of the particularly female scholars, younger female scholars and older female scholars, they're saying that this is still an issue, including issues of xenophobia that were so prevalent during Mussolini's years, have never fully, gone away and are kind of resurfacing depending on what this larger world is around them. So yeah, that's like unlike Germany. Sometimes scholars have pointed to Germany and said that they did do this very concrete reckoning with the past in a way to move forward, and not saying that Germany is a model or Germany is perfect, but they did deal with their authoritarian past in very different ways, Italy and Germany. And looking to the scholars that talk more robustly about that, I think that can shed some light on what happened after the war.
Mm-hmm. So if listeners were to take away one idea from Women of War, what do you hope that it is?
Well, I know, maybe about a year ago in the United States, I'm looking around and saying, oh my God, what can I do? I feel like I need to do something and I don't know what. And I was like, Suzanne, you wrote a book about this. In fact, you wrote 2 books about women who just created a movement from nothing. And the very first thing that these women did was just looked at what they could do in their community, closest to them. Anita, the very first thing that she took anywhere, her first staffetta job was bringing salt to people, to partisans who needed salt. So much of it was just getting together with people and talking and sharing ideas and feeling like you're not alone. What could I do to support this one person or this one group of people? And it really was this web of resistance that grew just one person at a time. And so that's been very inspiring to me in the past year of just one step at a time. Don't get overwhelmed. Don't try to do too much. Just think, how can I connect one neighbor and then another neighbor and then another neighbor? And and be willing to stand up for what you know is right.
Yeah. So indeed, being more engaged and do what you already know how to, and do it with other people.
Exactly.
So, any other comments or thoughts that you would like to share before we go into closing? This is an amazing read, so I really hope that
thank you. Well, I thank you for your great questions and your really close reading of it. And it's such an honor to be able to tell these stories, and I look forward to being able to share them more widely. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for restoring these women to the historical record. But unfortunately, our time together today is up, and il Big Ben ha detto stop, and it's time for us to say arrivederci e alla prossima. We want to thank you for tuning in into the program, and if you have any questions or comments, or if you have any topics you would like us to address, please contact us at italianradiohour@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. And remember, if you or any of your family and friends have missed a prior episode or would like to listen to this episode again, subscribe to the Italian Radio Hour on YouTube or where you catch your favorite podcasts. And don't forget to share this podcast, because sharing is caring. So thank you again to Suzanne Cope, author of Women of War, the Italian assassins, spies, and couriers who fought the Nazis. And also, since you are at the bookstore, get also a copy of Power Hungry. You will now regret it. And thank you to our sponsors, Istituto Mondo Italiano and La Prima Espresso. Until next time, alla prossima. Ciao ciao.
Grazie mille. Ciao a tutti.